subscribe.
So I figured I'd have to play a FIFA game at some point, given their popularity. I didn't have high expectations for this either since I'm not a big fan of sports games, and picked this one up at a garage sale for dirt cheap. Sports games are a dime a dozen, and it shows. This one had me feeling bored, confused, and let down all along the journey. If I could say something nice, it would be the music and the graphics. The licensed music isn't bad, and the graphics look pretty good for a PS2. This was released a while after the PS3 came out, so I would hope that it looks good on this machine. Now, even after trying FIFA 07, I still didn't quite get it. The manager mode was just confusing to me. I don't know much about how soccer teams work, and it felt like the game expected me to know going in. All the info on screen was overwhelming, and so I didn't last long in that mode. In the actual matches it was a little better, but not much. There's something about games like this that makes them feel sluggish, which I don't like. I assume they wanted to pursue realistic animation, but because of that, every action feels delayed, and it did nothing but bring me out of the experience. The controls were also a little more complicated than I had expected, and it took some time to get used to. Given how everything revolves around these matches, I could not find any real enjoyment from this. Although, if you're a huge soccer fan, I can see it.
4 out of 10!
This series is extremely samey from release to release. Most sports games are. Simply put, the sport doesn't change, but you know what does? The rosters. FIFA 09 felt almost exactly the same as 07. As such, pretty much all my criticism carries over. The graphics and music are still fine, everything else is either confusing or just underwhelming to me. The only thing that stood out to me was that they added a new simple control scheme to the matches, which I appreciated. It made those matches just a little more enjoyable since I could more easily sit back and watch the pretty graphics do their thing. I also think it's funny that they were still making these games on PS2. I get the PS2 was popular, but this doesn't really push any limits at this point.
5 out of 10.
No, I can get down with some Jeopardy. Similarly to the FIFA games, Jeopardy video games are all pretty similar. However, this is a little more up my alley. I also think that more people can generally play this together, as it doesn't require a lot of action or complicated controls. Every Jeopardy game is also dated as soon as it's released, since new topical questions can be made all the time. But playing this, I never really felt like anything was super limited to my knowledge of the 2000s. It was all a little more general or historical. That could also be because I hadn't played enough, though. My favorite part about this game, though, is that Alex Trebek appears in this game in full motion video, saying things between rounds and questions. I haven't played a lot of games with full motion video, but I like this implementation of the style. I believe when this game came out, we were at the end of FMV games in preference for making everything computer generated. But I thought seeing the host himself brought just a little more soul into what could have been a very sterile game.
6 out of 10!
Kingdom Hearts remained a bit of a roller coaster ride of pros and cons throughout my playthrough. On one hand, the game looks great. Yes, it's still PS2, but Square's decision to mix the Final Fantasy art style with the whimsical look of Disney holds up even today. On the other hand, I found the story kind of boring to get through. The overarching plot is just okay to me, and the plots within the Disney worlds are just bad retellings of the movies they came from. However, the music is fantastic. The original tracks all fit their mood very well, and I'm not just talking about the tracks taken from or inspired by Disney either. It's all well done. But I didn't care much for the combat. The command system they introduced is a cool idea, but it feels clunky switching between active combat and changing menus, and Donald and Goofy are rarely any help. I thought the game got interesting towards the end when they finally let go of retelling Disney stories and actually let Sora and company develop as characters. However, the combat never really clicked with me. The Keyblade feels incredibly simple and unsatisfying. The magic really comes down to spamming your shortcut spells of choice. For me, it was Aeroga and Curaga by a mile. Movement is fine, but jumping is delayed, which makes platforming sections a drag. Some of the set pieces were really cool and bosses were some fun, but the final boss was a total pain. I could go all day, but I'd say that on average, I had a good experience. It helps that I had someone helping me avoid the extra bad stuff. The one thing that kept me going was that there was a lot of promise in Kingdom Hearts. The beginnings of something really great, but not fully realized here.
7 out of 10!
Kingdom Hearts 2. In contrast to Kingdom Hearts 1, I had a pretty great time with this one all the way through. I'd also like to say that I've only played Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 right now, none of the other ones. As a result, the story here was a little confusing, but it didn't take long for me to embrace the silliness, and I actually ended up really liking the story. Xemnas and the organization were kind of the only downside for me. They're cool in theory, but they didn't really end up doing much themselves, just kind of trolling Sora along the journey, and Xemnas wasn't built up that well in my eyes either. His identity actually made the conclusion of Kingdom Hearts 1 less satisfying in retrospect, and he just kind of shows up. Maybe they needed a stronger connection to the rest of the series, or they couldn't come up with a better villain, I don't know. Everything else is top notch though. The world stories are less self-contained, and I didn't really mind the revisits. Movement is much better. Not Mario good, but still works great for this game. The combat is the biggest improvement for me. The longer combos and combo trees you gain throughout the quest is so much more satisfying than spamming that 3-hit combo from before. Magic is much more fun to use, as the ideal spells don't feel all defensive this time around. Don't let me forget the new form changes, which bring all the aforementioned combat improvements to 11. The only blemish on that is the random anti-form, which can be frustrating when you get it. I get that the developers wanted to discourage form spam, but couldn't they have better balanced the cooldowns instead? The combat still permeates every aspect of this game and brings it all up a level to me. It was so much fun, in fact, that I willfully grinded to level up before the final world. There's not a lot of games that make me want to do that.
9 out of 10!
First things first, Sly Cooper is just incredibly fun. Mixing in a stealth aspect to a platform collectathon is a great idea. It's something that other games like it only do in single levels. Here though, the developers took it and ran. They made a stylish world out of it too. The characters and setting feel like they were taken out of a Saturday morning cartoon, with a little bit of noir and a story inspired by Robin Hood. The presentation could have been a little better in my eyes. The music isn't anything great. It all feels like music to sneak around to, and that's good, but it doesn't really have me bopping my head or anything. The 2D animated cutscenes look cool, but in 3D things look a little odd, especially the character models. I think it has something to do with the cell shading. It doesn't really mesh well with some of the characters. Still, the gameplay is a lot of fun. While sneaking around is your best option, getting caught isn't as big of a deal as it would be in other games of its nature. As a result, it encourages stealth but doesn't discourage the player from trying to survive if they get caught. I like how Sly gets more and more abilities the more bottles you collect and stages you beat. It keeps things fresh, opening up strategies as the game gets harder. I wasn't that much of a fan of the bosses, however. These big battles feel contrary to the game's themes, and they tend to mess around with gameplay ideas that sometimes feel out of place. The final boss is the biggest offender with its weird flying shooting section that is just why. It makes the ending feel kind of weak.
7 out of 10!
Rather than build on top of what the original Sly Cooper did, Sly 2 decides to expand outward. Sly's movement is pretty much the same, no real complaints there. They ended up adding other things this time, which most of it is pretty good. Bentley and Murray are now playable, and they have their own upgrades to get and playstyles to learn. I don't really find Bentley or Murray as enjoyable as Sly, but they're still fun in their own right. I feel like the other changes lend themselves more to Sly's gameplay than the other ones, like how levels are now open sandboxes with missions. Possibly as a result, the areas feel more carefully designed. The spaces are filled with more enemies, corners, things to hide under, secrets to explore, etc. However, it all feels like it was meant for Sly to explore, as he is by far the most nimble character. It's good then that Sly still does most of the work. The levels are more engaging than before, there's more time spent in them, and when I get bored I can always switch to a side character if I want. I didn't notice many changes in the other aspects of the game. The story was a little better and slightly less one note than before, but the changes in design are the real sticking point here.
8 out of 10!
Sly 3 feels like it may have gone a little too far after Sly 2's design philosophy. The namesake character is no longer the main focus. He now equally shares with the other characters, which I think is to the game's detriment. There are also even more playable characters than before, and when trying to account for all of them, it feels like the design was diluted in the process. There's less focus pretty much everywhere. The story has to introduce and develop all these new characters which never live up to the main trio. The wide range of gameplay styles becomes a lot to handle, and you have to play all of them multiple times. The levels also have to account for everyone, and therefore they feel less focused. Requiring all these different styles in the game creates variety, but if something doesn't hit, it brings the whole game down as a result, and that's a shame. Unfortunately, this was my least favorite of the trilogy. Still fine, still okay, but clearly not my favorite.
6 out of 10!
When first booting up Star Wars Bounty Hunter, I was kind of excited. A Star Wars game where you can play as a bounty hunter is a very cool idea. However, in execution, this game fell flat on its face. I don't have many issues in terms of presentation or performance. Bounty Hunter runs well and looks fine for the PS2. But in design, it is mostly misses. Let's get some positives in here first. The control is smooth and responsive. You have a big list of tools at your expense if you wish to use them, including the twin pistols Django is known for, which are pretty fun to shoot. That's where my praise ends, because everything else is not great. The level design in this game is confusing. I had to refer to a guide multiple times because I could not figure out where I was supposed to go. When I did find out, I was amazed every time. It shouldn't be so hard to find my way. The levels are relatively linear, but set pieces look incredibly samey, and so I couldn't find the exit half of the time. Second, given that this game is called Star Wars Bounty Hunter, you'd think collecting bounties would be a significant part of this game. Well, they aren't. You sure can collect bounties if you want to, but they are entirely optional. It's laughable because if you don't care about collecting all the bounties for a good score, this game becomes incredibly short. Once I found out, I blasted through all the levels until I couldn't bear the boredom anymore.